What if I told you that American history is far stranger, sadder, and more astonishing than anything your textbook ever admitted? That there was once a wave of molasses that killed 21 people, a wildfire deadlier than any before or since, erased from memory on the very night it happened. Whole republics that rose, printed their own money and quietly vanished. Wars fought over a single pig. None of this is legend. None of it is conspiracy. Every chapter you're about to hear is documented, verifiable, and true. The dates real, the names real, the death tolls carved into records and courthouse ledgers, and old newspapers that nobody reads anymore. These are simply the stories that slipped through the cracks between the famous ones. There are 100 of them tonight, and you don't need to remember a single one. This is history meant to carry you off to sleep. So before we begin, if you enjoy quiet stories told slowly in the dark, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps these forgotten chapters find other night owls like you. And then please, get comfortable, dim the lights. Settle your head into the pillow, and let your shoulders go loose. You don't have to stay awake for the ending. Let the words do the walking. We'll count our way through 100 forgotten chapters, and there's no hurry at all. So let's begin, gently, with the disasters history simply misplaced. Let's start in Boston, in the winter of 1919. It's January 15th, an oddly warm afternoon in the North End. Above the crowded streets stands a great steel tank, 50 feet tall, holding more than 2 million gallons of molasses. And then, a little after noon, it fails. Witnesses said the rivets popped like machine gun fire before the tank simply came apart. A wave of molasses 15 feet high and moving perhaps 35 miles an hour rolled through the neighborhood, buckling the elevated railway, lifting houses off their foundations and swallowing whatever it touched. When it finally slowed and cooled and hardened, 21 people were dead, and about 150 were injured. It sounds almost comic, a flood of syrup, until you learn how many drowned in it, slowly, unable to pull free. The company blamed anarchists. The courts, after years of testimony, blamed the company. Bostonians swore that on hot days for decades afterward, the streets still smelled faintly sweet. And speaking of disasters the history books quietly walked past, most people have never heard of the deadliest wildfire in American history, though it happened on a night everyone remembers for something else. It's October 8th, 1871. In the timber country of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a drought-stricken forest erupts into a firestorm so hot it generated its own tornado of flame, leaping across the bay, overtaking people as they ran for the river. Somewhere between 1,200 and 2,500 people died that night. The exact number will never be known, because whole families and whole records burned together. And yet you've likely never heard the name Peshtigo. Why? Because that very same evening, hundreds of miles south, a fire broke out in Chicago. The Great Chicago Fire killed around 300 and stole every headline in the nation. Peshtigo, 5 times as deadly, simply slipped into the smoke. Now, if you think being overshadowed by bigger news is a cruel fate, consider the Sultana. It's late April, 1865. The Civil War has just ended, and a Mississippi steamboat legally rated to carry 376 passengers is instead packed with more than 2,000, most of them Union soldiers, freshly released prisoners of war, gaunt and desperate to get home. The boilers had been hastily patched. In the dark hours before dawn, a few miles north of Memphis, they explode. Fire and scalding steam tore through the crowded decks, and men who had survived the horrors of prison camps drowned in the cold spring river within sight of shore. Around 1,168 people died, a greater loss of life than the Titanic would suffer decades later. And almost no one noticed, because Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated just 2 weeks before, and the nation had no grief left to spare. Which brings us to a quieter kind of catastrophe, one that never even left the dock. It's the morning of July 24th, 1915 on the Chicago River. The excursion steamer Eastland is boarding thousands of Western Electric employees and their families for a company picnic, a day of sunshine and music. But the top-heavy ship, crowded with passengers crossing to one side, begins to list. Slowly, almost gently, still tied to the wharf, the Eastland rolls completely onto its side into the shallow river. Those on deck simply stepped off. Those below were trapped as the water rushed in. 844 people died that morning. most of them young women and children, some entire families wiped out at once, and the ship never even left port. And the water wasn't the only thing that turned a family outing to horror. 11 years earlier, on June 15, 1904, the steamship General Slocum set out on New York's East River carrying a church congregation, mostly German-American mothers and children, on a summer excursion. A fire began in a storage room. The crew was untrained, the fire hoses rotted through, the life preservers packed with crumbling cork that pulled people under instead of holding them up. Panicked passengers found the lifeboats wired in place. In minutes, the burning ship became a death trap on the water, and 1,021 people perished, an entire immigrant neighborhood, gone in an afternoon. It remained the deadliest single day in New York City's history until September 11, 2001. Fire, it turns out, found people everywhere they gathered, even in the places built to be safe. 6 months before the Slocum, in December of 1903, Chicago opened the magnificent new Iroquois Theater, advertised proudly as absolutely fireproof. At a packed holiday matinee, with children filling the seats, a stage light ignited the curtains. The fireproofing was mostly paint. The building's fire exits were locked or hidden or opened the wrong way, and the asbestos safety curtain snagged and never came down. Roughly 602 people died in minutes, still the deadliest single building fire in American history. The theater had been open for just 5 weeks, and our last forgotten disaster tonight came not from fire or water, but from the sky. It's the afternoon of March 18, 1925. A single tornado touches down in southeastern Missouri and simply refuses to lift. For 3.5 hours, it grinds northeast across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana, covering 219 miles, a wall of debris more than a mile wide, moving so fast and so steadily that many never saw it coming until it was upon them. By evening, 695 people were dead, thousands more hurt, whole towns flattened. It remains, a full century later, the deadliest tornado in the history of the United States. And a tornado, at least, announces itself with a roar. Water sometimes gives no warning at all. Which brings us up into the hills above Johnstown, Pennsylvania, on the last day of May, 1889. 14 miles upstream, in the mountains, sat an earthen dam holding back a private lake, a fishing and hunting retreat for wealthy men from Pittsburgh who had lowered the dam to widen the road across it and screened its spillway to keep their stocked fish from escaping. For days it had rained, harder than anyone could remember. A little after 3 that afternoon, the dam let go, and 20 million tons of water came down the narrow valley in a wall said to be 36 feet high, moving as fast as a train. It swept up houses, trees, livestock, locomotives, and miles of barbed wire from a factory in its path, gathering everything into a churning mass that struck Johnstown and then piled, burning, against the stone bridge. When the water fell, 2,209 people were dead. Some bodies were found as far away as Cincinnati, some were never identified at all. And speaking of whole cities caught below the water, none was ever caught so completely as Galveston, Texas. It's September of 1900. Galveston sits on a low sandy island off the Texas coast, the highest ground barely 9 feet above the sea, a booming port city of some 37,000 people who mostly dismissed the idea that a storm could ever truly threaten them. On the 8th of September, a hurricane came ashore with winds estimated well over 130 miles an hour, and it pushed the Gulf of Mexico ahead of it. There was no warning worth the name, no radar, no satellites, only a rising tide that did not stop rising until the entire island was underwater. Houses came apart. Families clung to floating debris in the dark. When the water finally drew back, somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people were dead. No one will ever know the true figure, making it, to this day, the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. Now, the sea can drown a city in a single night. A river takes its time. In the spring of 1927, after months of relentless rain across the whole watershed, the Mississippi rose and then broke through its levees in more than 140 places. The water spread across an area of some 27,000 square miles, parts of 10 states, a flood in places 70 miles wide and 30 feet deep. Around 700,000 people were driven from their homes, many into sprawling relief camps that lasted for months. The Great Mississippi Flood reshaped the country in ways that outlasted the water. It pushed the federal government into the business of flood control for good. It lifted the men who managed the relief into national politics, and it accelerated the Great Migration, as hundreds of thousands who had lost everything simply packed up and left the South for the cities of the North. And the water was not always the thing that killed. Sometimes it was the cold, arriving without warning on an ordinary afternoon. It's January 12th, 1888, across the Great Plains, Dakota Territory, Nebraska, Minnesota. The morning had been unusually mild enough that children walked to their one-room schoolhouses in light coats, and farmers went out without much thought. Then, in a matter of minutes, a wall of Arctic air swept down out of the northwest, temperatures plunging dozens of degrees almost instantly, the air filling with fine, blinding snow driven sideways by the wind. It struck, as luck would have it, right around the time schools were letting out. Teachers had to choose whether to keep the children through the night or send them home into a whiteout, where a person could freeze to death a few steps from their own door. Hundreds died, many of them children caught out walking. History remembers it as the children's blizzard. And speaking of storms that arrive before anyone can brace for them, consider the afternoon of September 21st, 1938, in New England. In an age before hurricane warnings meant much, a powerful storm that forecasters expected to curve harmlessly out to sea instead came racing north up the Atlantic at nearly 70 miles an hour, so fast the newspapers later called it the Long Island Express. It crossed Long Island and slammed into Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts with almost no warning at all. A storm surge 2 stories high swallowed beachfront communities whole. Entire summer colonies were simply washed away. Somewhere between 600 and 800 people died, many of them along the shore, caught by water they never saw coming. It remains one of the most destructive storms ever to strike the northeastern United States, and it is largely forgotten today. And our last forgotten weather catastrophe tonight unfolded while the country was looking the other way entirely. It's October of 1918. The nation's attention is fixed on 2 things: the final weeks of the First World War, and the influenza pandemic sweeping through every city and town. And in the dry cut-over timberland of northern Minnesota, around the town of Cloquet, a series of wildfires whipped up by high winds merged into a firestorm that raced across the countryside faster than people could flee. Whole towns burned in an afternoon, families crowded onto trains and into lakes and root cellars to survive. By the time the fires burned out, more than 450 people were dead. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in Minnesota's history, and yet buried beneath the headlines of war and plague, it slipped almost entirely out of the national memory. Now, fire and flood and wind are one thing. The ground itself is supposed to hold still. But in the winter of 1811 and into 1812, along the Mississippi River near a settlement called New Madrid in what is now Missouri, it did not. A series of enormous earthquakes, among the most powerful ever recorded in North America, struck the middle of the continent. The land rose and fell in visible waves. Great fissures opened, and for a time, near the epicenter, the Mississippi River itself appeared to run backward, as the riverbed heaved and the water rushed to fill new depressions. The shaking was felt across a vast stretch of the young country. It is said to have rung church bells more than 1,000 miles away, in Boston, and rattled windows in Washington. The region was thinly settled then, so the loss of life was small. Were the same quakes to strike that ground today, the story would be very different. The earth beneath us, it turns out, has always been full of hidden dangers, and by the turn of the 20th century, a great many Americans went down into it on purpose, every single day, to dig coal. Which brings us to the morning of December 6, 1907, in the town of Monongah, West Virginia. Just after 10 o'clock, an explosion tore through 2 connected mines, most likely coal dust or methane touched off by a spark. The blast was so violent it shook the town above and wrecked the ventilation the men below depended on to breathe. Rescue was agonizingly slow. There were almost no survivors to find. The official death toll was set at 362, though many believed the true number was higher, because the mine's own records of who had gone down that day were incomplete, and fathers often brought sons and relatives to help without ever signing them in. It remains the worst mining disaster in American history, and it helped push the country, at last, toward a federal bureau to oversee the mines. And speaking of the price of coal, less than 2 years later came the fire at the Cherry Mine in northern Illinois on the 13th of November, 1909. This one began almost absurdly. A car of hay, lowered to feed the mules that hauled coal underground, was set alight by a kerosene torch, and the flames spread through the timbered shafts. Many men escaped in the first minutes, but some went back down, again and again, to bring others up, until the cage could make no more trips. To save those still alive, the mine had to be sealed to smother the fire, trapping men behind the barriers. When it was finally reopened, 259 men and boys were dead. Yet 21 men who had walled themselves into a far chamber were found alive after 8 days in the dark. The disaster helped shame Illinois, and then the nation, into building the first real workers' compensation laws. Now, an explosion kills quickly. Some of industry's disasters killed slowly and quietly over years. Around 1930, near Gauley Bridge, West Virginia, crews began drilling a 3-mile tunnel through a mountain to divert a river for a hydroelectric plant, the Hawk's Nest Tunnel. The rock they cut through was rich in silica, and as the men drilled, the air filled with fine white dust. They were given little protection, and the work was driven hard and fast. Within months, workers began to sicken and die of acute silicosis, their lungs scarring until they could no longer breathe. Many of the dead were laborers who had come from far away for the work, a great number of them black men, some buried in unmarked graves. Estimates of the death toll run into the hundreds and beyond. It stands as one of the worst occupational health catastrophes the country has ever seen. And the danger was not only in mines and tunnels. Sometimes it was painted on with a fine brush. Beginning around 1917, in factories in New Jersey and Illinois and Connecticut, young women were hired to paint the numbers on watch and clock dials with a glowing radium paint so the dials could be read in the dark. To keep a fine point, they were instructed to shape the bristles with their lips. Lip, dip, paint, again and again, all day. The radium was thought, at the time, to be harmless, even healthful. It was not. The women began to suffer terribly, their jaws and bones deteriorating. A group of them sued in cases that dragged on as they grew sicker. The Radium Girls, as they came to be known, won important settlements, and their suffering helped establish the right of workers to sue over occupational disease and reshape safety law for everyone who came after. And speaking of invisible things in the air, consider the town of Donora, Pennsylvania, in the last week of October 1948. Donora sat in a river valley, ringed by zinc and steel works whose smokestacks ran day and night. Late that October, a temperature inversion settled over the valley, a lid of warm air trapping the cold air and the smoke close to the ground. The fog thickened and turned yellow and would not lift. For 5 days, people struggled to breathe. Some could not see across the street. By the time a rain finally broke the inversion, 20 people were dead and thousands more had fallen ill in a town of only 14,000. The Donora smog became a turning point, one of the events that pushed the United States, over the following years, toward its first real clean air laws. Now, if a quiet fog could kill 20, a single ship could kill hundreds in an instant. It's the morning of April 16, 1947, in the port of Texas City, Texas. A French cargo ship, the Grand Camp, sat at the dock loaded with more than 2,000 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer. A fire broke out in the hold. Crews tried to smother it. Crowds gathered on the docks to watch the curious-colored smoke, and then the whole ship detonated in one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. The blast flattened much of the waterfront, knocked planes from the sky, and set off a chain of fires and a second ship's explosion the next day. At least 581 people died, some so completely that they were never accounted for. It remains the deadliest industrial accident in American history. And our last chapter of industry tonight is one that is still burning. In 1962, in the small coal town of Centralia, Pennsylvania, a fire, most likely started while burning trash in an old strip pit, spread down into the labyrinth of abandoned mine tunnels beneath the town and reached the coal seams themselves. And there, underground, it simply kept burning. Efforts to dig it out or flood it failed. Over the years, the ground grew warm, Smoke seeped up through cracks, and sinkholes opened without warning. By the 1980s, the government began buying out and relocating the residents. Today, Centralia is nearly a ghost town, its streets cracked and steaming, a handful of holdouts remaining, and beneath it all, the fire is still burning, more than 60 years on, with fuel enough to last for centuries. Now, the men who went down into those mines, and the workers in those mills and factories, did not always suffer in silence. And the story of American industry is also the story of the clashes between labor and management that came with it. These next chapters are among the tensest in the nation's history, and I'll tell them plainly as they happened. Our first begins in the summer of 1877, during a long economic depression, when railroads cut their workers' wages yet again. In Martinsburg, West Virginia, crews walked off the job, and the strike leapt from city to city along the rail lines: Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, until much of the nation's rail traffic stood still. It was the first strike to spread across the whole country at once. In several cities, the confrontations turned violent, and state militias and ultimately federal troops were called in to reopen the lines. After some 6 weeks, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 subsided, having laid bare just how much the industrial age had changed the country. And speaking of confrontations that shaped the labor movement, consider Chicago in early May of 1886. Workers across the city were demonstrating for an 8-hour day. On the evening of the 4th, a rally was held near Haymarket Square. It was winding down, peacefully in the rain, when police advanced to disperse the remaining crowd. And then someone, to this day no one knows who, threw a bomb into the ranks of the police. The blast and the gunfire that followed left several officers and an unknown number of civilians dead. 8 men were tried in a case that drew criticism around the world for how it was conducted. Several were convicted and executed, though the actual bomb thrower was never identified. The Haymarket affair became one of the most debated episodes in labor history, and it is the reason much of the world marks the 1st of May as International Workers' Day. Now, 6 years later, the conflict moved to the steel mills. In the summer of 1892, at Andrew Carnegie's Great Steelworks in Homestead, Pennsylvania, a dispute over wages and union recognition brought the plant to a standstill. The company's manager, determined to run the mill without the union, arranged to bring in workers under the protection of hired Pinkerton agents, floated up the river on barges before dawn. The strikers were waiting on the bank. A gun battle broke out along the water that lasted much of the day, leaving men dead on both sides, before the Pinkertons surrendered. The state militia was sent in to occupy the town, and the mill eventually reopened. The Homestead strike was a defining moment for American labor, and its outcome shaped the balance between unions and industry for years to come. And speaking of railroads and the men who built their cars, in 1894 the trouble came to the Pullman Company, just south of Chicago. George Pullman built luxurious rail cars, and he housed his workers in a model company town that bore his name, where he also set the rents. When the Depression led him to cut wages without cutting those rents, the workers struck. The American Railway Union took up their cause and refused to handle any train carrying a Pullman car, and soon rail traffic across much of the country was paralyzed. Because the trains also carried the U.S. mail, the federal government obtained an injunction and sent in troops to restore the lines. The strike collapsed, and in its aftermath, partly as a gesture toward labor, Congress moved to make Labor Day a national holiday. Now, some of these confrontations ended in outright tragedy. In the coal fields of southern Colorado, striking miners and their families, evicted from company housing, had gathered in tent colonies through the winter of 1913 and into 1914. The largest stood near a place called Ludlow. On the 20th of April 1914, fighting broke out between the state militia and the strikers, and over the course of that day the camp caught fire. When it was over, more than a dozen people were dead, among them 2 women and 11 children who had sheltered in a pit dug beneath one of the tents and were trapped there. The Ludlow tragedy shocked the country and led to further violence in the region before order was restored. It remains one of the most somber chapters in the long history of American labor. And speaking of the mining wars of that era, a stranger episode unfolded in Arizona a few years later. In the copper town of Bisbee, on the 12th of July 1917, Striking miners had shut down the mines. That morning, the county sheriff deputized some 2,000 armed men, who went house to house and rounded up 1,187 striking workers and their supporters at gunpoint. They were marched to the rail yard, loaded into boxcars and cattle cars, and hauled 170 miles east, out into the New Mexico desert, where they were left at a remote siding. It became known as the Bisbee deportation, one of the most extraordinary mass expulsions in American history, and the subject of federal inquiry, though in the end no one was convicted. And our last labor chapter tonight is the largest of them all. In the coalfields of southern West Virginia, tensions between miners seeking to organize and the companies that controlled the region had simmered for years. In the late summer of 1921, thousands of armed miners assembled and began to march toward the southern counties. On the ridges of Blair Mountain, they met a defending force of lawmen, mine guards, and volunteers who had dug in with rifles and machine guns. For days the two sides fought across the wooded slopes. By some estimates, as many as 10,000 miners were involved, until President Harding sent in federal troops, and the miners, unwilling to fire on the U.S. Army, laid down their arms and went home. The Battle of Blair Mountain was the largest armed uprising in the country since the Civil War, and the largest labor confrontation in American history. The men who marched on Blair Mountain were far from the first Americans to take up arms against their own government, and the country was still very young the first time it happened. It's the autumn of 1786 in western Massachusetts. The revolution has been won, but the debts remain, and cash is scarce. Farmers who fought for independence now find themselves hauled before the courts, their land and livestock seized to satisfy creditors, some of them facing debtor's prison. And so they organize. Led by a former Continental Army captain named Daniel Shays, thousands of aggrieved farmers begin shutting down the courthouses, blocking the debt cases from being heard. In January of 1787, they march on the federal arsenal at Springfield, and a hastily raised militia turns them back with cannon fire. The rebellion sputtered out by spring, but the fright it caused rippled all the way to the men drafting a new government. It convinced many of them that the loose Articles of Confederation were not enough, and helped push the young nation toward the Constitution. And speaking of taxes stirring men to muster, the new government under that very Constitution soon faced a revolt of its own. It's 1794, on the Pennsylvania frontier. To help pay down the national debt, Congress had placed an excise tax on distilled spirits, and out on the western edge of the country, whiskey was not a luxury but a livelihood. Grain was hard to haul over the mountains. Distilled into whiskey, it became compact, valuable, and easy to trade. To the frontier distiller, the tax felt like a burden aimed squarely at him. Tax collectors were tarred and feathered, their homes surrounded, and the resistance swelled until it looked like open defiance of federal law. President Washington's response was to do something no sitting president has done since. He put on his old uniform and personally rode out at the head of an army of some 13,000 militiamen. The show of force was overwhelming, and the rebellion melted away before a single battle. A few men were convicted of treason. Washington pardoned them all. Now, if you're sensing a pattern of frontier farmers and unwelcome taxes, here's the third such revolt in barely a decade. It's 1799, in the German-speaking farm counties of eastern Pennsylvania. This time the grievance was a new federal property tax, levied to fund the very naval war we'll come to shortly. Assessors went door to door measuring houses and counting windows to determine what each home was worth, and to the Pennsylvania Dutch farmers, strangers pacing off their property and peering at their windows looked a great deal like tyranny returning. An auctioneer and militia captain named John Fries led the resistance, rallying neighbors to block the assessors and, at one point, marching to free tax resistors being held in Bethlehem. Federal troops were sent in once more, and Fries was arrested, tried, and sentenced to hang for treason. But President John Adams, over the objections of much of his own cabinet, granted him a pardon. The third tax revolt of the young republic ended, like the others, not with an execution, but with mercy. And not every act of defiance in these years involved muskets on a farm road. Some of it happened quietly, behind closed doors. It's December of 1814 in Hartford, Connecticut. The War of 1812 has ground on for 2 long years, and New England, its shipping strangled, its coast exposed, its trade with Britain in ruins, is deeply unhappy with the war and the government waging it. Delegates from the New England states gathered in secret to air their grievances. Behind those closed doors, there was talk of amending the Constitution to curb the power of the rest of the nation, and, at the edges, even murmurs of leaving the Union altogether. But the convention's actual proposals turned out to be measured. The trouble was the timing. Their envoys arrived in Washington carrying demands just as news came that the war had ended, and that Andrew Jackson had won a stunning victory at New Orleans. Suddenly, the Hartford delegates looked less like statesmen and more like sulking defeatists, and the Federalist Party, tainted by the whole affair, never recovered. It was, in effect, a rebellion that destroyed its own authors. Which brings us to a quarrel not over taxes or war, but over the simple question of who gets to vote. It's the early 1840s. In Rhode Island, long after the Revolution, the state was still governed by its old colonial charter, and that charter required a man to own a certain amount of land before he could cast a ballot. As mills rose in cities filled with workers who owned no property, more and more men found themselves shut out of the vote entirely. A lawyer named Thomas Dorr led a movement to write a new constitution, and when the sitting government refused to recognize it, the reformers held their own election and declared Dorr the rightful governor. For a brief, strange moment, Rhode Island had two governments claiming to be legitimate at once. Dorr's followers attempted to seize a state arsenal. The effort collapsed, and Dorr was convicted of treason and briefly imprisoned. Yet the cause largely won in the end. Within a few years, Rhode Island brought in the franchise, and the property requirement quietly faded away. And speaking of old rules that outlived their time, consider the strange rebellion that unfolded up the Hudson River in these same years. For generations, a handful of wealthy families had held enormous estates along the Hudson under a system left over from the Dutch and colonial past, a nearly feudal arrangement in which tenant farmers worked the land for life but could never truly own it, owing perpetual rent and fees to the landlord. When one of the great landlords died in 1839 and his heirs moved to collect years of back rent, the tenants finally refused. What followed stretched on for years. Farmers organized, withheld their rent, and blocked the sheriffs who came to collect or evict, and some of them did so in a peculiar disguise, dressing in calico gowns and sheepskin masks as so-called calico Indians, blowing tin horns across the hills to summon their neighbors whenever the law approached. The anti-rent war simmered until the mid-1840s, when the courts and the legislature finally began dismantling the old estates, and the last of America's feudal landholding quietly came apart. And our last uprising tonight put no muskets in anyone's hands at all, only worn-out boots on a long road. It's the spring of 1894, and the nation is sunk in a deep economic depression. Out of Massillon, Ohio, a businessman and reformer named Jacob Coxey set out to walk to Washington with a simple demand, that the government put the unemployed to work building roads. He called his marchers the Commonweal of Christ. The newspapers, more memorably, called them Coxey's Army. A few hundred men set off, gathering onlookers and stragglers as they trudged east through the mud toward the Capitol. It was, in truth, the first significant protest march on Washington in American history, the beginning of a tradition that would one day fill those same streets. And its ending was almost gentle in its anticlimax. When Coxey arrived and tried to speak from the Capitol steps, he was arrested. His crime? Walking on the grass? Rebellion, of course, is only one way a piece of America has tried to go its own way. Sometimes a corner of the map simply declared itself a country and got on with the business of governing, and a surprising number of them existed, however briefly, as republics and kingdoms all their own. Consider Vermont. It's 1777. The revolution is underway, and the green hills between New York and New Hampshire are claimed by both, a tangle of overlapping land grants that left the settlers there trusting neither. So they did something remarkable. They declared themselves an independent republic, and simply stayed that way for 14 years. Vermont wrote its own constitution, notably one of the first anywhere to ban adult slavery outright, minted its own copper coins, ran its own postal service, and conducted its own affairs as a sovereign little nation nestled among the colonies. It was neither one of the original 13 nor part of any other state. Only in 1791, after settling its long quarrel with New York, did Vermont at last join the Union as the 14th state. And speaking of would-be 14th states, Another one nearly made it in these same years, only to slip away one vote short. It's 1784, in the rugged country beyond the Appalachians, in what is now eastern Tennessee. Settlers there found themselves orphaned when North Carolina ceded their land to the federal government and then, months later, changed its mind and took it back. Feeling abandoned, the frontiersmen gathered, drew up a government, and named their new state Franklin, after Benjamin Franklin himself, whom they hoped in vain to win as a patron. They elected a governor, John Sevier, held courts, and for a few years ran the ordinary machinery of a state. Then they petitioned Congress for admission to the Union. 7 states voted yes, but statehood required a 2/3 majority, and Franklin fell just short. Left in limbo, harried by North Carolina and by disputes with the Cherokee, the little state slowly unraveled, and by 1789 it had faded entirely. The land would eventually become part of Tennessee. Now, farther south, another republic rose and fell so quickly you could have missed it in a single season. It's 1810 in the stretch of Gulf Coast known then as West Florida, the country around Baton Rouge, still held on paper by a Spain grown weak and distracted. The American and British settlers living there had little love for distant Spanish rule, and that autumn they rose up, overran the Spanish fort at Baton Rouge, and declared themselves the free and independent Republic of West Florida. They designed a flag, a single white star on a field of blue, the original Bonnie Blue, and elected a president. And then, almost as soon as it had begun, it was over. The United States announced that the territory had been part of the Louisiana Purchase all along and moved to annex it. The little Star Republic, which had governed itself for roughly 90 days, was folded quietly into the growing nation without ever firing a shot in its own defense. Which brings us to the far side of the continent, and a republic that lasted barely longer than a good vacation. It's June of 1846. War between the United States and Mexico has just begun, though word travels slowly, and a band of American settlers in the Mexican province of Alta California decide not to wait for news. They ride into the town of Sonoma, take the local commander prisoner, and raise a hastily made banner over the plaza, a rough flag bearing a star, a grizzly bear, and the words California Republic. The bear was reportedly drawn so crudely that some onlookers mistook it for a pig. For about 3 weeks, these settlers governed the self-proclaimed Bear Flag Republic. Then the U.S. Navy sailed into Monterey, raised the American flag, and the whole enterprise simply merged into the larger war. The Republic vanished almost before it began, but that grizzly bear and lone star still fly, to this day, over the state of California. And speaking of republics born from the churn of that same era's borders, a very different one had flickered to life just a few years earlier along the Rio Grande. It's 1840, in the wake of Texas breaking away from Mexico. In the northern Mexican states across the river, a faction that favored a looser, more federal system of government rose against the central authorities in Mexico City. They declared their own breakaway nation, the Republic of the Rio Grande, stretching across parts of northern Mexico and the disputed country of South Texas, and they made their capital at Laredo. It had a president, a cabinet, and a flag of 3 stars. But it never had much of an army, and the central government's forces pressed it hard from the start. Caught between Mexico and a Texas that offered sympathy but little real help, the Republic lasted less than a year before its leaders gave up the fight and made their peace. Today, its brief existence is remembered mostly in the border town where its capital once stood. Now, not every proposed state was small. One of them was proposed to be enormous. It's 1849. Mormon settlers, having trekked west to escape persecution, have established themselves in the basin of the Great Salt Lake, and they set about petitioning to govern the vast, empty desert around them. Their proposed state, which they called Deseret, a word from their scripture meaning honeybee, a symbol of industry, was staggering in size. As they drew it, it would have swallowed nearly all of present-day Utah and Nevada, great swaths of Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, and reached clear to the California coast to claim an outlet on the sea. Congress, unsurprisingly, balked at handing over so immense a domain. Instead, in 1850, lawmakers carved out something far more modest, the territory of Utah, a fraction of what Deseret's founders had envisioned. The name never became official, but it lingered for years in the settlers' own institutions, a ghost of the great desert state that might have been. And our last vanished realm tonight was not a republic at all, but a kingdom with a genuine crowned king. It's the 1850s on Beaver Island, a remote speck of land in northern Lake Michigan. A Mormon breakaway leader named James Strang, who claimed to be the rightful successor to the movement's founder, had gathered his followers on the island. And there he did something no one else in American history quite has. In 1850, with a paper crown and a red robe, he had himself formally crowned king. He ruled the island colony as a monarch in fact as well as name, passing laws, presiding over his subjects, and even winning election to the Michigan legislature while wearing the title of king. His reign lasted a few contentious years before it ended violently at the hands of disgruntled followers. With Strang gone, his little kingdom scattered, and the crown of Beaver Island passed quietly into the strange footnotes of the American past. For all the republics that rose and fell without a shot, America also fought a good many wars you were never asked to memorize, small ones, odd ones, and a few that were barely wars at all. Start with the first one after independence, which was fought entirely on the water against a former friend. It's 1798. France, in the throes of its own revolution, had been America's crucial ally against Britain not 20 years before. But relations had soured over unpaid debts, over insulting demands for bribes from French officials, over American ships trading with France's enemies, and French privateers began seizing American merchant vessels by the hundreds. The United States, with no formal declaration of war, quietly built up its young navy and struck back at sea. For 2 years, American and French warships dueled across the Caribbean in what came to be called the Quasi-War, an undeclared conflict, never voted on by Congress, fought ship to ship. It ended by treaty in 1800, the alliance quietly dissolved, and the two nations stepped back from a war neither had ever officially begun. And speaking of the young navy finding its footing, its next test came far from home on the shores of North Africa. It's 1801. For years, the Barbary states along the North African coast had preyed on Mediterranean shipping, seizing vessels and holding their crews for ransom, and the young United States, like European powers before it, had been paying tribute to buy safe passage. When the ruler of Tripoli demanded still more, and refused, declared war, the United States finally answered with warships instead of gold. It was America's first foreign war, waged across the sea against an enemy most Americans would never lay eyes on. The fighting produced enduring legends, the daring burning of the captured frigate Philadelphia in Tripoli's own harbor, and a march across the desert by a small band of Marines and mercenaries to storm the city of Derna. That desert campaign gave the Marine Corps a line for its hymn that Americans still sing today, "To the Shores of Tripoli." Now, not every American war was fought against a foreign power. A few were fought between Americans over a line on a map, and this next one was very nearly bloodless. It's 1835, along the border between the state of Ohio and the territory of Michigan. Both claimed a narrow strip of land around the mouth of the Maumee River, including the promising port town of Toledo, a claim rooted in old contradictory surveys nobody could quite reconcile. Both sides raised militias and marched them toward the disputed strip, bristling for a fight. And then, mercifully, almost nothing happened. The armies mostly failed to find each other in the swampy country. The only real casualty was a sheriff's deputy stabbed with a penknife who survived. Congress finally settled it by handing the Toledo Strip to Ohio and giving Michigan, as a consolation prize, the wild and remote Upper Peninsula. Michigan grumbled bitterly at the time, but that worthless peninsula turned out to hold vast fortunes in copper and iron, and Michigan, in the end, got by far the better deal. Which brings us to another bloodless standoff, this one along a border with a much larger neighbor. It's 1838, in the dense forest where Maine meets the British province of New Brunswick. The exact boundary had never been firmly drawn, and both American and British Canadian lumberjacks were felling timber in the contested Aroostook Valley, each accusing the other of trespass. Tempers flared, land agents were arrested, and both sides called out militia and appropriated money for war. Thousands of men tramped into the frozen woods, forts were built, and for a tense winter it truly looked as though the United States and Britain might go to war over a stretch of pine forest. But cooler heads prevailed. General Winfield Scott was sent north to arrange a truce, and diplomats eventually fixed the border by treaty. Not a single soldier died in battle. The only casualties of the so-called Aroostook War, by most accounts, were a few unlucky farm animals, livestock lost to the confusion of the mobilization. And speaking of wars whose only casualties had 4 legs, here is perhaps the most peculiar of them all. It's June of 1859 on San Juan Island, in the waters between Washington Territory and the British colony on Vancouver Island. Here, too, the boundary was ambiguous, and both Americans and British lived side by side on the island. Then an American settler shot a large black pig that had wandered into his garden and was rooting through his potatoes. The pig, it turned out, belonged to a British neighbor. The quarrel over the dead hog escalated with astonishing speed, from angry words to American soldiers landing on the island to British warships anchoring offshore, until hundreds of troops and dozens of naval guns faced one another over a single deceased pig. And yet no one fired. Wiser officials on both sides drew back, and the two nations agreed to occupy the island jointly, side by side, for 12 peaceful years, until an arbitrator finally drew the line. The only casualty of the pig war was the pig. Now, not every standoff of this era stayed so gentle in the telling, though this next one too ended with remarkably little blood. It's 1857. Relations between the federal government and the Mormon settlers who had built a thriving territory in the Utah desert had grown deeply mistrustful, and President Buchanan, believing the territory to be in a state of rebellion, dispatched a large army west to install a new governor and assert federal authority. The settlers, fearing another chapter of the persecution that had driven them across the plains, prepared to resist, raiding the army's supply trains, burning forage, and readying to put their own towns to the torch rather than surrender them. For a winter, the army sat stranded in the cold near a burned-out fort while emissaries shuttled back and forth. In the end, negotiation won out over battle. A pardon was offered and accepted. The new governor was installed peaceably, and the army marched through a quiet, evacuated Salt Lake City without a fight. The Utah War had passed, tense and costly, but very nearly bloodless. And our last forgotten war tonight was fought not for American soil at all, but for a cause an ocean away. In the years just after the Civil War, thousands of Irish immigrants who had fought in that war, hardened veterans in blue and gray alike, belonged to a brotherhood called the Fenians, dedicated to winning Ireland's independence from Britain. And some of them hit upon an audacious plan. Since they could not strike Britain directly, they would seize the nearest piece of the British Empire, Canada, and hold it as a bargaining chip to trade for Irish freedom. Between 1866 and 1871, bands of armed Fenians crossed the border again and again from Vermont, from New York, from as far west as the Dakotas, briefly raising the green flag on Canadian soil before being driven back. The raids never came close to succeeding, and the United States eventually moved to shut them down. But they left a lasting mark, helping, in their strange way, to nudge Britain's scattered Canadian provinces toward uniting into a single nation of their own. And speaking of men who marched off toward strange horizons, the frontier itself was stranger than any invasion, and it begins with an experiment involving camels. It's the 1850s, and the United States Army has a problem. The vast deserts of the Southwest are murder on horses and mules. So the War Department, at the urging of Secretary Jefferson Davis, imports several dozen camels from the eastern Mediterranean, along with a few handlers, and turns them loose to haul supplies across Texas and Arizona. And here's the odd part, it worked. The camels carried heavier loads, went longer without water, and crossed sand that broke ordinary pack animals. Soldiers hated them anyway. The beasts spat, smelled peculiar, and frightened the horses. Then the Civil War arrived and swallowed everyone's attention, and the Camel Corps was quietly forgotten. Some camels were sold, some simply wandered off. For decades afterward, startled prospectors and railroad crews reported wild camels drifting through the southwestern desert, ghosts of a good idea the country never quite finished having. And speaking of good ideas that turned out to be too good to be true, consider the Great Diamond Hoax of 1872. Two weathered prospectors named Philip Arnold and John Slack walked into a San Francisco bank, and with great reluctance, let it slip that they had found a remote field studded with diamonds, rubies, and sapphires simply lying in the dirt. They had, in fact, salted the ground themselves, scattering cheap uncut gems bought abroad across an empty stretch of high country. The story spread, and money came running. Some of the most respected bankers and financiers in San Francisco and New York poured a fortune into this scheme, forming a company worth millions before a single stone was properly examined. In the end, it was a government geologist, Clarence King, who rode out to the field, studied it, and realized no natural deposit ever produced diamonds and rubies side by side in the same gravel. The gems had been planted, the investors had been fleeced, and the swindlers slipped quietly away. Now, if salted diamonds cost men their savings, the next chapter cost men their lives, and it turned on the ancient quarrel between the powerful and the small. It's 1892, in Johnson County, Wyoming. The open range is closing, and wealthy cattle barons who once let their herds roam free find themselves crowded by small ranchers and homesteaders, whom they accuse, sometimes fairly and sometimes not, of rustling stray cattle. So the big operators hired a small army of gunmen from Texas and drew up a list of men to be killed. The hired guns rode north, besieged a pair of accused rustlers at a lonely cabin, and shot them dead, but word raced ahead across the county. Soon hundreds of armed settlers surrounded the invaders in turn, and the whole affair might have ended in a massacre had the United States cavalry not been ordered in to break it up. The killing stopped. The courts, tangled in money and politics, saw almost no one punished. And speaking of the mountains swallowing those who crossed them, few names carry the weight of the Donner Party. In the spring of 1846, a group of emigrant families set out from the Midwest for California, some 87 souls in a train of wagons. They were persuaded to try an untested shortcut, which cost them precious weeks, and left them exhausted and behind schedule when they reached the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada. Then in early winter, the snow came, and it came deep and fast, sealing the high passes. They built rough cabins and lean tows and waited, and the food ran out, and the cold pressed in. As members of the party began to die of starvation and exposure, some of the survivors, facing a slow, certain death, did the thing everyone remembers. They ate the bodies of those already gone. Of the 87 who set out, roughly half lived to see the rescue parties climb up out of the white. And the Donner families were not the only travelers caught by a mountain winter that season of westward hope. 10 years later, in 1856, came the tragedy of the Willie and Martin handcart companies. These were Mormon emigrants, many of them poor converts from Europe, too poor to afford oxen and wagons, so they walked, pulling their belongings west across the plains in small two-wheeled handcarts, on foot from Iowa toward the valley of the Great Salt Lake. 2 of these companies started dangerously late in the year. When early savage snows fell across central Wyoming, they were caught out in the open, thinly clothed, their food nearly gone, hauling their carts into the wind. People began to freeze and to starve along the trail. Rescue parties raced east from Salt Lake City through the storms to reach them, and saved many, but more than 200 died before it was over, one of the worst tragedies in the long history of American overland migration. And speaking of long, desperate journeys across that same unforgiving West, we come to the flight of the Nez Perce in the year 1877. For generations, the Nez Perce had lived in the plateau country of what is now Oregon, Idaho, and Washington. When the government moved to confine them to a reservation and fighting broke out, a band of some 700 people, only a fraction of them warriors, chose to leave rather than surrender, and set out toward Canada. What followed was a fighting retreat of roughly 1,170 miles, across mountains and rivers, and the newly made Yellowstone National Park, the Nez Perce outmaneuvering and outlasting far larger army forces again and again over more than 3 months. They were stopped at last in the Bear Paw Mountains of Montana, barely 40 miles from the border. Their chief Joseph surrendered, and the words attributed to him, that he would fight no more forever, have echoed ever since. Both sides had suffered, and both had shown endurance. And our last strange tale of the frontier tonight rode not on horseback but on iron rails. It's April of 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, deep in Confederate Georgia. A group of Union volunteers, led by a civilian scout named James Andrews, slipped south in disguise with an audacious plan to steal a train and wreck the railroad line that supplied the Confederate Army. At a breakfast stop while crew and passengers ate, The raiders quietly uncoupled a locomotive called the General and steamed away north, meaning to burn bridges behind them as they went. But the train's conductor gave chase, first on foot, then by handcar, then aboard other engines, refusing to let go. For some 87 miles the two trains raced up the single track, the raiders cutting wires and dropping crosties, the pursuers pressing relentlessly on, until the General finally ran out of fuel and the exhausted Union men scattered into the woods. Most were caught. It remains one of the strangest chases the war ever produced. And speaking of things that were not at all what they appeared to be, the frontier gives way now to an age of glorious American humbug, and it starts with a giant asleep in the earth. In October of 1869, workers digging a well on a farm in Cardiff, New York, struck what looked like the petrified body of a 10-foot man, gray and weathered and folded in the soil. Word spread like fire, and thousands of curious people paid to file past the giant, some convinced he was a fossilized man from biblical times, others sure he was an ancient statue. In truth, he was neither. A tobacconist named George Hull, weary of arguing about giants in scripture, had secretly commissioned the figure carved from a block of gypsum, buried it, and waited a year before having it dug up. Even after scholars pronounced it a fake, the crowds kept coming, and the great showman P.T. Barnum refused the chance to buy it, simply built a copy of the fake and exhibited that. People paid to see the fake of the fraud too. And speaking of the public's bottomless appetite for wonders, 34 years earlier a New York newspaper had discovered just how much a reader would swallow. In the summer of 1835, the New York Sun ran a series of breathless articles claiming that the famous astronomer, Sir John Herschel, peering through an enormous new telescope at the southern tip of Africa, had observed life on the moon. And not merely life. Forests and inland seas, herds of bison, blue unicorns, tailless beavers that walked upright, and, most memorably, winged people covered in fur, who flew about the lunar landscape and appeared to hold conversations. Each installment was richer than the last, and the sun's circulation soared to among the highest in the world. There was, of course, no such telescope and no such discovery. The whole thing had been written for amusement and profit. When the truth came out, the paper barely apologized, and readers, having enjoyed the ride, seemed hardly to mind at all. And speaking again of Barnum, for the great showman was rarely far from a marvel, we come to the creature he called the Fiji mermaid. In 1842 he began exhibiting what he advertised as the preserved body of a genuine mermaid, supposedly caught in the South Pacific near the Fiji Islands. Handbills showed a lovely long-haired maiden of the sea. The thing itself, displayed under glass, was rather less lovely, a shriveled, grimacing object about 3 feet long, in truth the upper body and head of a young monkey carefully sewn onto the dried tail of a large fish. This seemed disguised with skill. It was grotesque, and it was obviously stitched together, and none of that mattered. Paying crowds lined up around the block to peer at the little horror and argue about whether it could possibly be real. Barnum understood something enduring about human nature. People will happily pay for the pleasure of deciding for themselves. Now, if those hoaxes worked because people wanted to believe, our next chapter is a hoax of a different kind, a story about a panic that was itself half invented. On the evening of October 30th, 1938, the young Orson Welles and his radio company broadcast a dramatization of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, staged cleverly as a series of live news bulletins interrupting an ordinary music program. Listeners who tuned in late heard urgent reports of Martian cylinders landing in rural New Jersey, of heat rays and poison gas, and armies overwhelmed. Some number of people were genuinely frightened, phoning relatives or police, but the newspapers, no friends of upstart radio, seized on the story and vastly inflated it, describing mass hysteria, highways clogged with fleeing families, and citizens driven to the edge of madness, most of which never happened. And so the broadcast became famous chiefly for a panic that was mostly a myth, and we have been retelling that myth ever since. A myth about a myth, and speaking of stories that refuse to settle, few have argued on as long as the Kensington runestone. In 1898, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Öhman reported that, while clearing land near Kensington, Minnesota, he had pulled up a heavy slab of stone tangled in the roots of a tree, its face covered in runic carvings. Translated, the inscription told of a party of Norse explorers, Swedes and Norwegians, who had journeyed deep into the North American interior in the year 1362 and who had returned to camp to find some of their men dead. If true, it would rewrite the map of who reached the middle of the continent and when. Most scholars who have examined the language, the runes, and the weathering conclude that it is almost certainly a modern hoax or a well-meaning fiction. And yet the stone endures in a small Minnesota museum, and its defenders endure too. And the argument has now outlasted everyone who first had it. And speaking of things that fell inexplicably from the sky, we come to one of the strangest few minutes in the history of a Kentucky farm. On an early spring day in 1876 in Bath County, Kentucky, a woman making soap in her yard reported that flakes of what looked like fresh meat began drifting down out of a perfectly clear sky, scattering across an area of several hundred feet. The flakes were a few inches across. Curious men who examined and, being curious frontier men, in a couple of cases tasted the substance, pronounced it something like mutton or venison. Scientists puzzled over samples for a while. The explanation most experts eventually settled on is memorable in its own right. A flock of vultures, circling high overhead and startled or simply gorged, had disgorged their most recent meal all at once, in the way vultures do when alarmed, raining it gently down upon the astonished farm below. And our last piece of humbug tonight is not a hoax at all, but a true day so eerie that people mistook it for the end of the world. It's May 19th, 1780. Across New England, the morning began ordinarily enough, and then, as the hours passed, the sky darkened, until by noon it was so black that people lit candles to eat their midday meal, and birds went to roost, and the cattle returned to their barns. No eclipse could explain it. To many devout New Englanders, it seemed plainly that Judgment Day had arrived. In the Connecticut legislature, as frightened members moved to adjourn, one man named Abraham Davenport is remembered for refusing, saying that if it were not the day of judgment there was no cause to adjourn, and if it were, he wished to be found doing his duty and so called for candles. The cause, we now understand, was smoke from great wildfires burning far to the north, thickened by fog and cloud. And speaking of ordinary days that turn strange, we leave the world of hoaxes for the quieter mysteries of the human body itself, beginning with a cook whose name became a byword. In the first years of the 20th century, a healthy, hard-working Irish immigrant named Mary Mallon took jobs cooking for well-to-do families around New York. Wherever she worked, people fell ill with typhoid fever, and eventually a sanitary investigator traced the outbreaks back to her kitchen. Mary Mallon was that rare and at the time barely understood thing, an asymptomatic carrier. She felt perfectly well, yet her body harbored the living bacteria and passed them, through the food she prepared, to those she fed. She never believed she was sick, because by every sense she had, she wasn't. Public health authorities eventually confined her to a small island in the East River, released her once on a promise to stop cooking, and when she quietly returned to it, confined her there for the rest of her life. She was not wicked, only unlucky and contagious. And speaking of children carried far from where they began, we come to the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 200,000 orphaned, abandoned, and homeless children of the crowded eastern cities, many the sons and daughters of immigrants overwhelmed by poverty and disease, were gathered up by charitable societies and placed aboard trains bound for the countryside. The idea, novel and controversial even then, was that farm families in the Midwest and beyond might take these children in, give them a home and clean air and work to do, and raise them as their own. At each stop, the children would be lined up on a platform or a church stage for the local families to look over and choose. Some found genuine love and belonging. Some found only extra hands for the chores. Brothers and sisters were often parted forever on those platforms. It was by turns a rescue and a heartbreak, and it quietly rehomed a population the size of a city. Now, if the orphan train scattered a city's worth of children, our next chapter erased a city's worth of lives, and did it in a matter of weeks. In 1918, as the Great War ground toward its end, a strain of influenza swept across the world and through the United States with astonishing speed and cruelty. Unlike ordinary flu, it struck down not only the very young and very old, but healthy adults in the prime of life, sometimes killing within a day or two. In America alone, it is estimated to have taken around 675,000 lives in a span of months. more than the number of Americans killed in all the combat of all the centuries' wars combined. Cities ran out of coffins, schools and theaters closed, and people went massed in the streets. And then, strangely, once it had burned through the population and faded, the whole catastrophe slipped from the nation's memory, rarely spoken of, a mass grief the country seemed to want to forget. And speaking of things carried quietly in the blood, high in the hills of eastern Kentucky lived a family whose story is gentler and stranger than any of these, the Blue Fugates. Their ancestor, Martin Fugate, settled in an isolated hollow along Troublesome Creek in the early 19th century, and he happened to carry a rare recessive gene for a condition called methemoglobinemia, which affects how the blood carries oxygen and can give the skin a striking blue cast. In so remote a place, with few new families marrying in, that recessive gene met itself again and again down the generations. And so, every so often, a Fugate child was born with skin of a genuine deep blue, blue as a clear evening, otherwise perfectly healthy and often long-lived. Neighbors wondered and whispered. It was only much later that a curious doctor worked out the harmless genetics behind it, and even offered a simple medicine that could pinken the skin, though the blue itself carried no illness at all. And speaking of families who lived apart from the ordinary world, few withdrew as completely as the Collier brothers of New York. Homer and Langley Collier were educated, well-born men who, over the decades, sealed themselves inside their once grand Harlem brownstone and let the outside world fall away entirely. They boarded up the windows, stopped paying for gas and electricity and water, and filled the house, room by room and floor by floor, with an unimaginable accumulation of things. Newspapers saved for decades, broken furniture, pianos, the chassis of a car, all of it packed into narrow tunnels through the debris. Langley, it is said, rigged those tunnels with booby traps to catch intruders. In the spring of 1947, acting on a report of a dead body, police broke in and, after an enormous search through the wreckage, found both brothers dead among roughly 140 tons of hoarded belongings. One had been crushed, it seems, by a trap of his own devising. And speaking of houses that grew strange around the people inside them, none is stranger than the Winchester Mystery House of San Jose, California. Sarah Winchester was the widow of the heir to the Winchester rifle fortune, a wealthy and grieving woman who, having lost her husband and her only child, moved west and bought an unfinished farmhouse. And then she began to build, and did not stop, for some 38 years. Crews of carpenters worked in shifts, day and night, adding room upon room until the house sprawled to well over 160 of them. What makes it famous is its glorious strangeness: staircases that climb into the ceiling and stop, doors on upper floors that open onto empty air, hallways that narrow to nothing, windows set into interior walls. Whether she built to a plan, or to soothe her grief, or, as legend insists, to confuse restless spirits, the endless mansion she left behind still stands, beautiful and baffling. And our last quiet mystery of the body tonight belongs to a preacher who claimed to have left one life and begun another. In 1776, in the state of Rhode Island, a young woman named Jemima Wilkinson fell gravely ill with a fever, and to all appearances came very near to death. When the fever broke and Wilkinson rose again, it was with an extraordinary declaration that Jemima Wilkinson had died, and that the body was now animated by a new spirit neither man nor woman sent to preach. From then on the preacher answered only to the name the public universal friend, dressed in flowing robes that belonged to no single sex, and refused all gendered pronouns. And people listened. The friend drew a devoted following, traveled and preached for years, and eventually led the faithful into the wilderness of upstate New York to build a community of their own. There, calm and certain to the end, the public universal friend lived out a long and singular life. And on that gentle note we rest a moment, and speaking of people who slipped quietly out of the world's sight, let us turn now to the ones who vanished entirely, the colonies, the ships, and the secrets that history simply lost track of. We begin on the coast of what is now North Carolina, in the summer of 1587. A group of about 115 English settlers, men, women, and children, came ashore on Roanoke Island to plant England's first real foothold in the New World. Their governor, John White, sailed back to England for supplies, and by the time war with Spain finally let him return, 3 long years had passed. When he landed in 1590, the settlement stood empty. No people, no bodies, no sign of struggle, only the houses taken down and one word carved into a wooden post, Scrotone, the name of a nearby island and a friendly tribe. A storm drove White off before he could search further, and he never found them. To this day, no one knows for certain what became of the lost colony of Roanoke. And Roanoke was not the only English settlement to quietly disappear from memory, though the next one at least left us a paper trail. It's 1607, the very same year that Jamestown was founded down in Virginia. A few hundred settlers landed at the mouth of the Kennebec River, in what is now Maine, and built themselves a fort they called Popham Colony. The winter was brutal, colder than anything they had imagined, and morale sank with the temperature. But before they gave up, those settlers did something remarkable. They built a ship, a 30-ton sailing vessel they christened the Virginia, the first seagoing ship ever constructed by the English in the Americas. And then, after barely a year, discouraged and homesick and short of leaders, they simply packed up and sailed home. Jamestown, struggling as it was, endured and became the story every schoolchild learns. Popham was abandoned and forgotten, its fort swallowed back by the forest, remembered today mostly by archaeologists gently brushing dirt from its foundations. And speaking of Jamestown surviving, survival there came at a price almost too grim to say aloud. The winter of 1609 into 1610 is remembered simply as the starving time. Several hundred colonists had crowded behind the walls of the fort, hemmed in and unable to hunt or forage, their supplies dwindling by the day. They ate their horses first, then the dogs and cats, then the rats and mice, then the leather of their own boots. And when that was gone, some of them did the unthinkable. For centuries, this was only a rumor, a story too dark to quite believe until, in 2012, archaeologists unearthed the bones of a 14-year-old girl bearing the unmistakable marks of butchery. The evidence confirmed what the old accounts had whispered, that in their final desperation, the settlers had turned to cannibalism. Of roughly 500 colonists, only about 60 were still alive when spring and fresh ships finally arrived. Jamestown lived, but only barely. Now disappearances at sea have always carried a special kind of dread, and few are stranger than the one that swallowed the USS Cyclops. It's March of 1918. The Cyclops was a massive Navy collier, a coal-carrying ship longer than a football field, steaming from Brazil up toward Baltimore with a cargo of manganese ore and 306 people aboard. She made a scheduled stop in Barbados, took on supplies, and put back out to sea. And then nothing. No distress call, no wreckage, no oil slick, no lifeboats. The ship and every soul on her simply ceased to exist somewhere in the waters that would later be nicknamed the Bermuda Triangle. The Navy searched and theorized for years. A sudden storm, a structural failure, an overloaded hold, perhaps an engine already known to be troubled. No cause was ever proven. To this very day, the loss of the Cyclops remains the single largest loss of life in the history of the United States Navy, not caused by combat. And speaking of ships that vanished beneath the waves, one of them made history on its way down. It's a February night in 1864, in the harbor off Charleston, South Carolina. A strange, narrow iron vessel slips through the dark water, barely more than a converted boiler with a hand-cranked propeller, the HL Hunley, one of the very first submarines ever sent into war. 8 men sat hunched inside, turning the crank by hand, guiding a spar tipped with a charge of gunpowder toward an enemy warship, the USS Housatonic. The charge detonated. The Housatonic went down, and the Hunley became the first submarine in history ever to sink an enemy ship in combat. And then, having made history, the little submarine signaled once toward shore and never came home. It sank with all 8 of its crew and lay lost on the harbor floor for more than a century. In 2000, the Hunley was finally located, raised, and gently brought back into the light. And from a mystery of the sea, we turn to a mystery of the land, one written in code. In 1885, a small pamphlet appeared in Virginia telling a curious tale. Decades earlier, it claimed, a man named Thomas Jefferson Beale had buried a fortune in gold, silver, and jewels somewhere in the hills of Bedford County, and had left behind 3 ciphered papers describing the treasure, its location, and the names of its rightful heirs. There was just one problem. Only the second of the three ciphers had ever been cracked, decoded using, of all things, the text of the Declaration of Independence, and it described the riches without quite revealing where they lay. The other two have resisted every codebreaker who ever tried. Treasure hunters have dug across those Virginia hills for generations and found nothing at all. Many scholars now suspect the whole story was an elaborate hoax, a 19th century tall tale. But the Beale ciphers endure, still uncracked, still tempting. And our last vanished wonder tonight didn't disappear so much as arrive blazing out of a quiet sky. It's the first days of September 1859. The sun unleashed the most powerful geomagnetic storm ever recorded, an event we now call the Carrington event, named for the English astronomer who watched the solar flare that caused it. When the storm struck the earth, the telegraph, the great new nervous system of the age, went haywire. Sparks leapt from the equipment. Some operators received electric shocks. In a few places, telegraph lines kept working even after their operators unplugged the batteries entirely, running on nothing but the current in the sky. And overhead, the auroras blazed so brightly that gold miners in the Rocky Mountains rose and made breakfast, thinking dawn had come. The northern lights were seen as far south as Cuba and the Caribbean. Were a storm that size to strike today, the damage to our wired world would be almost beyond reckoning. And so we leave the mysteries of nature behind and turn instead to the schemes of men, the plots, the panics, and the peculiar episodes of American public life. We begin with a man who had already made history in the worst way. Aaron Burr had served as Vice President of the United States and had famously killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. But his strangest chapter came afterward. Between 1805 and 1807, Burr traveled through the western frontier, gathering men, boats, and money for some grand venture in the lands beyond the Mississippi. What exactly he intended has never been entirely clear. His accusers claimed he meant to peel away a chunk of the young nation, or to seize territory from Spanish Mexico, and to crown himself the ruler of a private empire. Burr insisted he only meant to settle a tract of farmland. He was arrested, charged with treason, and put on trial in 1807 before the Chief Justice himself. The evidence never quite held together, and Burr was acquitted, though his name never recovered. And speaking of men who vanished under a cloud of suspicion, our next chapter began with exactly that. In 1826, in upstate New York, a stonemason named William Morgan announced that he was about to publish a book exposing the secrets of the Freemasons, the fraternal order to which he had belonged. Before the book appeared, Morgan was arrested on a flimsy debt charge, bundled into a carriage, and never seen again. What became of him was never proven, but the public was electrified. Outrage over his disappearance swelled into a genuine political movement. The Anti-Masonic Party, founded around 1828, the first true third party in American history. It rose on suspicion of secret societies and the belief that powerful men were conspiring beyond public view. And though the party itself burned out within a decade, it left behind something that outlasted it entirely. The anti-Masons were the first to gather delegates from across the country in a single hall to choose their candidate, the National Nominating Convention, a fixture of American politics to this very day. And speaking of movements built on a single burning conviction, few have ever burned brighter or cooled faster than the followers of William Miller. Miller was a New York farmer and lay preacher who, after years of poring over the prophecies in his Bible, became convinced that he had calculated the date of the end of the world. Christ would return, he taught, and the earth would be made new. And by 1844 he had drawn tens of thousands of believers, the Millerites, across the northeastern states. They settled on a date in October of 1844. As it approached, some sold their belongings, left their crops unharvested, and waited in white robes for the heavens to open. And then the day came, and the sun rose and set and rose again, and the world simply continued. They called it the Great Disappointment. Many drifted away heartbroken, but others regathered, rethought what they had expected, and from that quiet wreckage grew new religious movements that endure and number in the millions today. Now, from the disappointments of heaven, we descend to a riot over, of all things, Shakespeare. It's May of 1849, outside the Astor Opera House in New York City. Two celebrated actors, the American Edwin Forrest and the Englishman William Macready, had become bitter rivals, each with passionate partisans who argued over which of them performed the great tragic roles better. It sounds like the gentlest of quarrels. It was not. Beneath the theatrical rivalry ran a deeper current, resentment between working-class New Yorkers, who claimed Forrest as their own, and the wealthier set who favored the refined Englishman. When Macready took the stage, a crowd of thousands gathered outside, hurling stones and breaking windows. The militia was called in, and in the chaos, soldiers fired into the mob. More than 20 people were killed and scores wounded. It remains one of the deadliest riots in the city's history, a class feud in the end, fought through the curtain of the theater. And speaking of tensions simmering beneath the surface of respectable life, our next chapter is one of the strangest to ever reach the halls of Congress. In 1934, a retired Marine Corps general named Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated Marines who ever lived, came before a congressional committee and told an extraordinary story. He testified that the year before, a group of wealthy businessmen had quietly approached him, hoping to enlist him to lead a march of veterans on Washington and pressure the government into changing course. The alleged scheme became known as the business plot. The men named denied everything, and no one was ever charged. But the committee that investigated did not simply dismiss it. In its final report, it stated that it had been able to verify certain of Butler's assertions. What the plot truly amounted to, and how serious it ever was, historians still debate. But that a decorated general made the claim under oath, and that Congress took it seriously enough to investigate, is a matter of public record. And speaking of veterans marching on Washington, that very image had already played out, in earnest, just 2 years before. It's the summer of 1932, in the depths of the Great Depression. Thousands of veterans of the First World War, many of them jobless and hungry, traveled to the capital with their wives and children. They had been promised bonuses for their wartime service, payments not due to be paid out for years, and they came to ask that the money be released early, while they needed it most. They built a sprawling camp of shacks and tents along the Anacostia River and settled in to wait. They called themselves the Bonus Army. After weeks of stalemate, the government ordered the camp cleared, and troops moved in to carry out the order. The camp was emptied and burned, and the veterans dispersed. It was a somber episode, and the images of it lingered in the nation's memory for a long time afterward. And after all that, let us end this chapter with something far lighter. A story involving no plot at all, only cheese. It's 1837, in the final days of Andrew Jackson's presidency. A dairy farmer had sent the president an extraordinary gift, a single wheel of cheddar cheese weighing 1,400 pounds, roughly 4 feet across. For over a year it sat curing in the White House, filling the halls with its ripening aroma. And as Jackson prepared to leave office, he decided the cheese should not go to waste. So he threw open the doors of the mansion and invited the public, anyone at all, to come and help themselves. Thousands poured in. In about 2 hours, the entire enormous wheel was devoured, trampled, and smeared into the carpets and walls. The cheese was gone by evening, but its perfume lingered for weeks, and staff reportedly aired the place out long after. Democracy, it seems, smelled faintly of cheddar. And speaking of the odd corners where history unfolds, let us turn now to the wars that came home, the battles, raids, and secret schemes that touched American soil itself. We begin in the autumn of 1864, in the small town of St. Albans, Vermont, less than 15 miles from the Canadian border. The Civil War was raging hundreds of miles to the south, and Vermonters felt about as far from the fighting as anyone could. And then, one October afternoon, some 24 young men who had been quietly checking into local hotels for days suddenly drew revolvers, announced themselves as Confederate soldiers, and robbed all 3 of the town's banks at once. They made off with more than $200,000, exchanged shots in the street, and galloped north across the border into Canada, where they had staged the whole operation. Canadian authorities arrested them but ultimately released them, ruling it an act of war rather than common robbery. The St. Albans raid stands as the northernmost land action of the entire American Civil War. And speaking of the war reaching places it wasn't supposed to, some of the most unexpected fighting happened deep within the Confederacy itself. In the piney backwoods of Jones County, Mississippi, a farmer named Newton Knight came to oppose the Confederate cause. Around 1863, Knight gathered a band of like-minded men, deserters, draft resistors, and small farmers weary of a war they felt was not theirs, and together they took to the swamps and forests. From that cover they resisted Confederate authority in their corner of the state, skirmishing with troops sent to bring them to heel, and evading capture in country they knew far better than any outsider. Legend later dressed the episode in all sorts of colors, and the details are still argued over by historians. But the core of it is documented. For a time, in one rural Mississippi county, a group of armed men stood apart from the Confederacy around them. The stories called it the Free State of Jones. Now, from a war on home soil, we move to a war that existed almost entirely in the imagination, though the shells were real enough. It's the night of February 24th into the 25th, 1942. Pearl Harbor had been attacked barely 11 weeks earlier, and the entire West Coast was braced for a Japanese assault at any moment. Late that night, over Los Angeles, something set the nerves of the city ablaze. Air raid sirens wailed. A blackout was ordered, searchlights swept the sky, and the anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. For hours, gun crews pumped more than 1,400 rounds of ammunition up into the darkness, chasing shapes in the searchlight beams. Shrapnel rained back down on rooftops and streets, and when dawn finally came and the smoke cleared, there was no enemy to be found. No bombs had fallen, no aircraft were confirmed, no wreckage recovered. The whole terrifying battle had been fired at empty sky. History remembers it, a little sheepishly, as the Battle of Los Angeles. And speaking of enemies who really did come, quietly by sea, our next chapter reads like a spy thriller, except that it happened. In June of 1942, a German submarine surfaced in the dark off the coast of Long Island, New York, and put 4 men ashore in a rubber raft. Days later, a second U-boat landed 4 more on a beach in Florida. These 8 were Nazi saboteurs, trained in explosives and sent under a plan called Operation Pastorius to blow up American factories, bridges, and rail lines. They carried crates of explosives and thousands of dollars in cash, and they slipped inland into the crowds of wartime America. And then the whole scheme quietly fell apart, not through some clever manhunt, but because one of the saboteurs lost his nerve and telephoned the FBI to turn himself in. At first they scarcely believed him, but he named the others, and within 2 weeks all 8 were in custody. Their grand campaign of sabotage ended before it had truly begun. And speaking of attacks launched across great distances, one of the war's strangest weapons drifted in silently, on the wind. Late in the conflict, in 1944 and 1945, Japan devised a way to strike the American mainland from thousands of miles away without a single aircraft. They built balloons, large ones, made of paper and paste from mulberry trees, armed them with bombs, and released them into the jet stream, that high, fast river of air flowing eastward across the Pacific. Roughly 9,300 of these Fugo balloon bombs were launched, and some did reach North America, landing as far inland as the western states. Most did no harm at all. But in May of 1945, near the town of Bly, Oregon, a woman and 5 children out for a Saturday picnic came upon one of the fallen balloons in the woods. It detonated. All 6 were killed, 5 of them children. They were the only people killed by enemy action on the American mainland in all of the Second World War. And speaking of the war touching American ground, it did so most directly of all in a place few think to look, the far northern islands of Alaska. In June of 1942, Japanese forces invaded and occupied 2 of the Aleutian Islands, the remote fog-shrouded specks of land called Attu and Kiska. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign troops held American soil. The campaign to take them back, fought through 1942 and into 1943, was a miserable one, waged in freezing rain, dense fog, and biting wind, where the weather killed nearly as surely as the enemy. The battle to retake Attu was among the costliest of the Pacific War for the numbers engaged. And when American troops finally stormed Kiska, they found it empty. The Japanese had slipped away under cover of fog days before. Overshadowed by the great island battles farther south, it became known simply as the Forgotten Battle. And our last chapter of War Tonight is a war of pure illusion, an army that fought by pretending. Somewhere in the fields of Europe, as Allied forces pushed across the continent, there operated a most peculiar American unit. Officially, it bore a dull, forgettable designation, but history knows it as the Ghost Army, roughly 1,100 men whose entire purpose was deception. They were artists, designers, sound engineers, and radio operators, and their weapons were inflatable rubber tanks, dummy trucks, and phony cannons that two men could lift and carry. They played recordings of rumbling armored columns over enormous speakers, broadcast fake radio chatter, and painted false insignia, all to convince the Germans that great armies stood where there were none, and that the real forces were somewhere else entirely. Time and again they staged these grand illusions near the front lines, drawing enemy attention away from where the true blow would fall. For decades their work stayed classified, a secret theater of the war, hidden in plain sight. And a deception unit built entirely of illusion is, in its own way, the perfect doorway into the last of our forgotten chapters, a closing gallery of curiosities, of endings and oddities and quiet mercies, the odds and ends that history kept in the bottom drawer. There are 9 of them left, and then we'll let you sleep. So stay loose and let them drift past you like the last few cars of a long, slow train. We begin, though, with one more disaster because the war years held so many. It's the night of July 17th, 1944, at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine on San Francisco Bay. 2 cargo ships sit at the pier, being loaded with ammunition bound for the Pacific, the work done by hand, in the dark, by sailors given little training for such dangerous cargo, most of them young black men. A little after 10, something ignites. The explosion was so enormous it registered on seismographs and threw wreckage thousands of feet into the air. 320 men died in an instant and hundreds more were injured. In the aftermath, when many surviving sailors refused to return to the same unsafe work, 50 were convicted of mutiny in a trial that drew national attention. The episode became one of the quiet pressures that pushed the Navy, a few years later, toward desegregation. And speaking of things that vanished all at once, few disappearances in American history are stranger or sadder than that of a bird. The passenger pigeon was once the most abundant bird on the continent, perhaps in the world. Flocks a mile wide and hundreds of miles long would pass overhead for hours, darkening the sky at noon and breaking the very branches they landed on. There were billions of them. And then, in the span of a few decades, through relentless hunting and the clearing of the forest they nested in, they were simply gone. The last of her kind was a bird named Martha, who lived out her final years alone in the Cincinnati Zoo, with no other passenger pigeon left anywhere on Earth to answer her. She died in her enclosure on the 1st of September, 1914, an entire species winking out in a single quiet cage. The bison came within a whisker of the very same fate, and this is where our gallery turns gently hopeful. Tens of millions of them once moved across the Great Plains in herds so vast that early travelers described the ground itself as seeming to shudder and roll. By the 1880s, through decades of hide hunting and the opening of the West, those tens of millions had been reduced to only a few hundred wild animals, a species that had defined a continent, now small enough to count. But this story, unlike the pigeons, was caught in time. A handful of ranchers, naturalists, and early conservationists gathered the last scattered animals, protected them, and let them slowly multiply. From those few hundred, the herds crept back. The bison never again darkened the plains as before, but they endured, a rescue pulled off in the final hour. Now, if a monument to a vanished bird sounds melancholy, consider a town that built a monument to a pest and meant it as thanks. In 1919, the people of Enterprise, Alabama erected in the middle of their town a statue, a graceful woman holding aloft, of all things, a giant boll weevil. The boll weevil was a beetle that had marched across the South, devouring the cotton crop, and it had devastated the local farms. But in ruining the cotton, it forced the farmers to try something new, and they turned to peanuts, and the peanuts made them prosperous. And so, in gratitude for the hard lesson, Enterprise raised what is still the only monument in the world dedicated to an agricultural pest, a small wry act of civic good humor that has stood for over a century. Not every animal in this gallery fared so gently, and this next one will tell plainly and briefly, because it is a somber little corner of American folklore. In September of 1916, in the town of Irwin, Tennessee, A traveling circus elephant known as Mary was put to death after she killed her handler. The method the town chose was a railroad crane, and a large crowd gathered to watch. It was a grim and strange event, remembered ever since as one of the darker curiosities of small-town Americana, the kind of story people repeat in disbelief and would rather not have been true. From a strange death to a strange fear, it's 1892, in rural Rhode Island, in the depths of a tuberculosis outbreak that people of the time called consumption. The Brown family had been losing its members one by one to the wasting illness, and their neighbors, frightened and grasping for an explanation, settled on an old folk belief that one of the dead was somehow rising to drain the life from the living. And so the villagers exhumed the body of a young woman named Mercy Brown, who had died that winter. Finding her better preserved than they expected, they took it as proof, burned her heart, and mixed the ashes into a tonic for her ailing brother in a desperate attempt to save him. He died anyway. It was one of the last gasps of the New England vampire panic. Not malice, but grief and superstition colliding in the dark. Now, to lift the mood, let us turn to what may be the single most farcical event ever held under the banner of sport. It's the summer of 1904, at the St. Louis Olympics, and the marathon is run at the hottest part of a brutally hot day, over dusty roads choked by the cars of the officials driving alongside. What followed reads like invention. One leading runner collapsed and, it was later told, was given a mixture of rat poison and brandy by his handlers as a stimulant, and half delirious was more or less carried across the finish line. Another runner, exhausted, simply climbed into a passing automobile and rode much of the way, hopping out near the end to jog in. A third was chased off course by a pack of stray dogs. Almost no one who has heard the full story has ever forgotten it, the strangest race the Olympics may ever have seen. Our second to last chapter is a shadowed one, and we'll present it as the historians do, with the verdict still open. In the coal country of Pennsylvania in the 1870s, a wave of violence and intimidation was blamed on a secret society of Irish miners known as the Molly Maguires. Whether they were a true organized conspiracy or a loose scapegoat for the tensions of the coalfields is debated to this day. What is certain is how the story ended. A Pinkerton detective infiltrated the miners' communities for years, and his testimony sent the accused to trial. 20 men were convicted and hanged. Historians still argue over how many were truly guilty, how many were swept up, and how fair those trials could have been. A chapter that remains, even now, genuinely unresolved. And so we come to the 100th and final forgotten chapter, and we've saved a quiet, hopeful one for the end. It's 1879, in Nebraska. A Ponca chief named Standing Bear had left the reservation his people had been moved to, walking hundreds of miles to bury his young son in the homeland where the boy had been born. For leaving, Standing Bear was arrested, and his case came before a federal court. The government's position was that a Native American was not, in the eyes of the law, a person who could even bring such a case. The judge disagreed. He ruled, for the first time in American law, that Standing Bear was indeed a person under the law, entitled to the same right of habeas corpus as anyone else, and ordered him freed. Standing at his own trial, the chief is remembered for holding out his hand and saying that the blood that ran through it was the same color as any other man's. And on that small, quiet act of recognition, we'll bring our 100 chapters to a close. That is 100 forgotten chapters, and yet, if we're honest, it is only a thin handful drawn from an ocean. For every story told tonight, there are 1,000 more still sleeping in the archives. In courthouse ledgers and parish records and brittle newspapers no one has opened in a lifetime, waiting quietly for someone to remember them. History is far larger and far stranger than any of us will ever finish reading. But that is a task for other nights. For now, there's nothing left for you to do. Thank you for spending these slow hours here in the dark with me. It's a gift to have your company. If you're somehow still awake, you can let the video drift on, or come back another evening, and we'll wander through more of the forgotten together. There's no hurry, and there never was. So let your breathing settle, and let the day go. Rest now, sleep well, and I'll be here whenever you'd like to listen again.